Hello, welcome everybody. Let me share my screen. Thanks for being here. I know Friday, you're going to learn quite a bit today, hopefully, or you can engage in however you need to. But can everybody see educational equity right now? Okay, great.
All right, so we are going to take about 2 minutes for you to review this slide and as a warm-up to the topic that we're going to talk about today. So what we would like for you to do is to review the spectrum of educational equity. So there is a scale from 1 to 7, including, again, it's a spectrum, so from beginning to taking action. And I'd like for each of you to review the different points on this scale and think about where you are. We're going to do an anonymous poll at the end of that time, and we just would like to get a sense of who is in the room and where you are in terms of equity. So again, take about a minute to review, and then we'll pull some responses from you before we get started. All right, just by thumbs up, has everyone gotten a chance to read what's on the slide? Excellent. All right, and I'm going to launch a poll because we'd love to hear where you all think you are. No, this is excellent. Aiming for 100% participation. So we've got 4 more people left to respond. All right. Thank you all. So I'll end the poll and I'll share the results. Can you all see the results? Excellent. So it looks like we've got some folks, about 10% of us, who are still in the beginning phase, and that's okay. You're completely welcome. And we're going to use we're going to share a lot of terminology in this space, and so you'll be able to learn with us. And we see a lot of folks along the spectrum in the 3 through 7, which is great. I love all those 5s as well. So I'll stop sharing, and we'll get an opportunity to dive into some of this content. All right, so welcome to our presentation. It's called STEM Equity and Decolonization. How do I even do that? I'm Dr. Stacy Lawrence, and my colleague, Christina, wave along, Christina,
Hello.
is here as well. And just a little bit of background, we actually facilitated this workshop at the annual conference, ASEE, back in June, and so we're happy to provide a virtual space to continue this conversation. So here are our session objectives. By the end of the session, we have 4 goals. And so you'll begin to identify equity focused policies and actions that you can take or have been taking in your classroom. You'll begin to identify and define the effects of colonization in your classroom. You'll be able to describe what knowledge is to you and your discipline. And last but not least, we'll have an opportunity to discuss how to integrate body, spirit, mind into your teaching and problem solving. So as an overview, we'll first have a section on educational equity. I'll share a definition of educational equity that we'll use for the time in our workshop. And then you have a moment to reflect on what equity-focused policies currently exist in your work. And then I'll transition to Christina, where she'll spend some time talking about decolonizing knowledge. And questions we'll ask during that time is, what does it mean to decolonize? What do I or we count as knowledge? What is a holographic epistemology? And how do I integrate this into my courses or my work? And just so you're ready, in terms of the level of activity, this will be an interactive session. So you'll have times where you'll be able to engage in individual reflections. Those will set you up nicely for the small breakouts that we'll be doing. And then we have resources that you can make copies of and take with you via Google Doc. And we will have opportunities for you to engage with each other as well in the chat.
Okay, so we wanted to give you some context as to where we're coming from and why we're here in this space right now and why this topic and why it's of interest to us personally. And so just so you know where I'm coming from, my name's Christina Smith. I was born and raised in Salt Lake City, Utah, in a suburb there. Here you'll see on the left are a picture of my mom and my dad. My dad is from the Navajo Nation, grew up in New Mexico, was part of the boarding school system for a while, and had a lot of different educational experiences in that space, both positive and negative, as you could probably imagine. And my mom was a kindergarten and first grade teacher for her whole life. And so education was something that was really important to me and my family. And how that shows up for me is I went to the University of Utah as an undergraduate student. It's a public institution. I went there to study chemical engineering. And the reason behind that was I knew it was going to be hard and I thought I wanted to do something difficult, but also the potential of financial gain. So that was initially what my goals were when I started as an undergraduate student. But those changed as I went through my course curriculum. A couple of things that showed up for me there was not being able to connect with the content maybe in the same way as other people around me were at the time. And it's still a pretty male-dominated field. And so some of the examples used and some of the canonical examples were not as accessible to me. And so I started to think about, well, there's got to be different ways to think about teaching and learning in this space. And as I grew as a junior and a senior, I started to get into mentoring and outreaching programs, and I thought this was pretty interesting. And from that, again, continuing this idea of education, my mom was a teacher of how could things be different? So I decided to go to Oregon State University, which is another public institution, to study engineering education. And while I was there, I studied undergraduate students and graduate students' ways of knowing. So we'll talk about ways of knowing in epistemology today, and I'll give some examples of that. And really trying to understand how does that impact the way that we teach and see and learn engineering ideas and concepts. As a graduate student, I met my husband, who's this picture right here, as well as this amazing community of women, which was really important for me as a graduate student to continue on. Graduate school was a difficult space, and so I wanted to make sure I had that community with me. And so all of those experiences brought me to Brown, which is a private institution. I do work on STEM education. I work with undergraduate students primarily in problem solving and teaching. But I've been starting to think for myself, trying to tap back into my roots and who I am as a person, of thinking of what about decolonization? What about my indigenous identity? How does that show up in the space, or how does it not show up in the space? How have we created or not created spaces for it to be talked about? And so that's what brought me to this conversation today. I wanted to explore that a little bit more for myself because the STEM space doesn't always provide those opportunities for us.
Thanks for sharing, Christina. So a little bit about me and my educational journey. I was actually born in the beautiful island of Jamaica, but I was born and raised, well, I was born in Jamaica, raised in Boston. And this is a picture of my family here celebrating a wedding. And when I was a child, I was a product of the Boston public school system, and I dreamed of going to medical school. Next slide. To college, I went to college at Clark University, which is in Worcester, Massachusetts. I earned a degree in biology, and I was a part of a lot of student organizations. And I think part of that was because I couldn't find people who look like me or reflections of me and my identity in the classroom, but I did find that in many counter spaces, such as student organizations and things of that nature. And throughout that time, I made tons of friendships that will last me a lifetime. In graduate school, I was able to conduct exciting research at a couple of universities, and I earned a PhD in plant biology. And throughout this time, I was able to continue to reflect on who I am as a person and the things that were reinforced and the things that were not reinforced or accepted in those spaces. So I was able to develop a lot of resiliency and spend a lot of time reflecting and doing a lot of personal development. Now, I'm a faculty developer at Brown with Christina, and I spend a lot of time working with faculty members to think about how to make their courses more inclusive and equitable for the students that they have in their spaces. And as an extension, I do that for the STEM community as well. So how do faculty and educators and staff members at universities think about how to make equitable educational journeys for the students that are studying currently? So we'll transition now to talk about what is educational equity. We've spent a lot of time mentioning it, but what does it mean? So this definition from the Equity Institute says that educational equity is the intentional development and alignment of policies and practices to promote psychological safety, psychological and physical, intellectual, and emotional well-being. Next slide. So one way that we're going to provide a framework for educational equity comes from this work from Dr. Malcolm Picue. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And this demonstrates this paper that she put together for a conference a couple of years ago, talked about what STEM education or the journey of STEM in the United States of America. And there are many policies that were put in place that were on a spectrum from race neutral to race conscious, and that were both, or that could be either inclusive or exclusive. And that's demonstrated on this scale here. Can you click one? All right. So what we're going to say is that that equity-focused teaching is both inclusive and race conscious, and that's highlighted here by the top right box. Given what's been happening in the news lately, I'm making an assumption that many of us are aware of the term race conscious. And if you're not, if you click one more time, I have another definition for you here. So an equity-focused teaching and teaching that is inclusive and race conscious takes active steps to eliminate disparities in educational access and outcomes for racially minoritized students, while accounting for the ways in which racism has limited educational opportunities for these populations in the past. Click one more time. So this is just a moment of reflection. Given the definition of equity-focused policy or action, I'd like for you to jot down, if you have a quick piece of paper next to you, an example or a lack of example of an equity-focused practice in your current classroom, research, or work environment. I will give you about 30 seconds to jot that down before we transition to the next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to transition to Christina, and she's going to share how we can leverage other ways of knowing, particularly from a decolonization lens, to advance educational equity in our teaching and learning environments.
Okay, so if we think about that equity-focused idea of being race-conscious inclusion, thinking about how to decolonize a classroom space fits within those parameters. But what does it mean to decolonize? So let's start with this idea. So on your own, before we even get into our own definitions or sharing different ideas of definitions, I'd want you to take a moment and think about how would you define decolonization based on whatever knowledge you have or whatever knowledge you don't have, just based on that word, how would you define it? So just take a minute or so for that. Okay. So shortly, Stacy will be sharing a worksheet that you can tap into to take your own notes on. And it'll be a space for you to capture what your thoughts are during this process. So if you don't see that in the chat, let us know, but there's a Google Doc that you can make a copy of. So just take a second for that.
Can you make it available for us because I don't have access?
And then as soon as you have access to it, if you will give us a thumbs up, I can move on to this next piece. Okay, thank you. I see a couple. Thank you, Hector. Okay. All right, so hopefully you've jotted down some ideas of how you would define decolonization. Still no access for Michael.
Michael, did you try the second link that I shared?
And while you're working through that, I am going to move to the next piece. So I'm going to play this video twice. So I want you to just kind of listen to it the first time, and then I'll play it again so you can kind of capture some other ideas that pop into your head. But this is one definition of thinking about decolonization.
Decolonization is less about returning to a pre-colonial society and more about recognizing that
Can you hear that? Okay, just double checking.
we live under a colonial system. That things are the way they are, not by accident, but because a particular ideology has systematically erased others while normalizing itself. Once something is normalized, it's hard to imagine anything else. We become confined within that particular ideology. And then the mindset of, it's always been this way, starts to creep in. And then the origins of the colonizers, which in our case was a very violent one, can be forgotten. We start sweeping things under the rug, and that's why many people are confused by things like the Māori Health Authority and even iwi settlements. And so when we're able to recognize these structures through what will be a never-ending process of decolonization, it helps us move forward towards a society which doesn't just draw inspiration from a diversity of spaces, but is also self-aware, which I think is the most important part.
Okay, so I'm going to play it again and just take some notes of things that pop out for you.
Decolonization is less about returning to a pre-colonial society and more about recognizing that we live under a colonial system. That things are the way they are, not by accident, but because a particular ideology has systematically erased others while normalizing itself. Once something is normalized, it's hard to imagine anything else. We become confined within that particular ideology. And then the mindset of, it's always been this way, starts to creep in. And then the origins of the colonizers, which in our case was a very violent one, can be forgotten. We start sweeping things under the rug, and that's why many people are confused by things like the Māori Health Authority and even iwi settlements. And so when we're able to recognize these structures through what will be a never-ending process of decolonization, it helps us move forward towards a society which doesn't just draw inspiration from a diversity of spaces, but is also self-aware, which I think is the most important part.
Okay.
Decolonization is less.
I need to get to the next slide. Might take a second. Hold on. Okay. So this is coming from the Aotearoa Liberation League. So that's kind of a definition that they've come up with from their group. But this is another way to think about decolonization. So the act of decolonization occurs when we explore and understand the other ways of coming to know the world that extend beyond the Western paradigm. So things that come about for me, pop out for me within these two definitions are becoming more self-aware, not just within our institutions, but the way that we move throughout different spaces, trying to identify what has been normalized and why, challenging the idea that it's always been this way, and exploring other ways of understanding. And as I mentioned in the video, but also in the space that we started at the beginning, this is an ongoing process. And so it doesn't matter where you were on the educational equity space, it doesn't matter where you are in your understanding of what this definition means. It's an ongoing process and something that will be done throughout our lives. So I do want to just pause really briefly, and if anybody wants to write in the chat, just some ideas that really popped out for them and listening and looking at those two definitions of decolonization and how they might have been similar or different from what you were thinking. Let's just take a minute and have you just jot down some things in the chat for that. Okay. Feel free to share. Okay, so some similarities, exploration of others, ongoing self-reflection, other ways of knowing, correlating with this idea of valuing multiple ways of learning and knowing. And this is the conversation that we'll move to in just a minute, but taking away boundaries, looking forward, not just undoing. Yeah, so just recognizing that it's a process. It's something that we're not trying to return back to a pre-time, but it's trying to understand and learn how we got to this point and how we want to change or how we want to move forward. Ownership of knowledge in academia, definitely. Yep, things aren't accidental. So if we go back to thinking about educational policies, especially in the United States, if we think about that, policies were put in place to promote certain ideas and certain ways of knowing and thinking. Okay, so thinking about different, okay. Unlearning norms and contents. Yeah, and so this, again, unlearning these things or recognizing these things or becoming more self-aware is this ongoing process. And things will pop up in your daily life or decades from now that maybe you didn't notice before. The mind and the system itself. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Feel free to keep putting things in the chat if you want to. I did want to talk about this idea of decolonizing methodologies, just to bring in some other ideas to think about before we move into the space of what could you do? So Decolonizing Methodologies is this fantastic book by Dr. Smith, who is a Maori scholar. She's writing this book from the perspective of anthropology, but I think it's a very helpful way and alternative way of thinking about how do we approach research and methods. So when I was reading it as a STEM, as a chemical engineer, I could definitely see the types of questions that she was asking or the approaches that she was questioning really resonated with me. And so one of the quotes that she has in the chapter of her book is that we have a history of people putting Maori under a microscope in the same way a scientist looks at an insect, or any engineer, scientist, or whoever might be looking at something. And the ones doing the looking are giving themselves the power to define. And that showed up quite a bit in some of your comments as well, of thinking about who's doing the looking is defining that for themselves. And that has different contexts. Sometimes that's a positive and effective way to think about things, depending on your context. And sometimes that can be harmful for other people. And so when thinking about colonizing knowledges, most of the traditional disciplines, and we can think about STEM space in that particular way, are grounded in cultural worldviews in which are either antagonistic to other belief systems or have no methodology for dealing with other knowledge systems. And again, I saw that somewhat echoed in what you were writing in the chat of these certain ways of knowing and having a particular way of having things done. If we think about our curriculum and how we teach it, that's a particular way of knowing. It's very traditional. And so it's becoming self-aware and trying to figure out, well, how do we think about other knowledge systems? So the way that I wanted to think about decolonizing for us today specifically, again, it's a process. There's a lot of different entry points, but the point that we're going to talk about today is thinking about epistemology, or the theory of knowledge or ways of knowing. And so epistemology looks at different aspects of knowledge. It thinks about the authority of knowledge. So who has it, who doesn't have it, who do I get it from, who do I not get it from? Is it me creating it? Is it you creating it? There's different ways to think about authority. The source of knowledge, is it me? Is it a textbook? Is it my teacher? Is it a YouTube video? Is it my feelings and what I've experienced in different situations? As well as the validity of knowledge. So how do I know that's true? Or how do I know that this chunk of knowledge is valid? And so I wanted to bring up focus on epistemology because I think the ways that we think about knowing in our classrooms and the ways that we teach content impacts what that diverse group of spaces, how to diversify and draw inspiration from, as was quoted in the video. And so here we might have very traditional idea here on the left of thinking about textbooks and things that have been around for hundreds of years from a Western perspective that we tap into for knowledge. But there are other things like observational knowledge sources, like observing these ants. There's things like having a connection to your spirituality and having a connection to your feelings and emotions. That can be a source of knowledge as well. And then in some indigenous spaces, thinking about how we can draw from our dreams, that spiritual aspect of knowledge, and how there's validity and authority within those spaces that sometimes we don't even talk about in STEM spaces. So if we looking at this spectrum of ideas of Western theories of knowledge, it results in a certain way that we teach, by which we come to learn about the world around us. We're probably pretty familiar with the scientific method and how that's been indoctrinated in a lot of different ways. And so that's a particular way that we teach, the way that we think about science. Kind of in this indigenous space and in thinking about decolonizing, theory of knowledge that can encapsulate different philosophies, ceremonies, histories, and experiences with the sacred as specific ways of knowing, which in turn reflect multiple sources of knowledge. So we're going to spend a little bit of time today thinking about what are alternative sources of knowledge outside of what we've traditionally seen and thought about. So how we're going to do that is we'll put you in breakout rooms, and this is part of your worksheet. And so feel free in your breakout rooms if you want to have your video on or off, engage in however feels comfortable for you. But in your small groups, I want you to answer these two questions for yourselves. How is knowledge created, developed, processed, communicated, so forth in your discipline? And how would you describe your department or discipline's culture of knowledge? So thinking about what is embedded in your culture of knowledge, how does your discipline think about knowledge, maybe versus a different discipline? So I'm going to pause here and stop sharing my screen to see what questions do you have about what I'm asking you to talk about next. And I'm going to put this in the chat as well. So this is on your worksheet as well as in the chat. And so we'll put you in your breakout rooms and have a conversation about that. Let's see. And we'll take about 10 minutes. I know some people have already popped out, but. Let's see, which role I'm going to put you in. Okay. So welcome back. It looked like people were having conversations about hopefully these questions, or maybe it spurred other questions for you. But as I mentioned, I'd be interested to hear from one or two groups, whether you want to put it in your chat or if you want to raise your hand in this space. Just kind of share what you talked about in your group. What came up for you?
Well, I'll go ahead and share for our group and then others who can supplement what I say, but a lot of the discussion revolved around, certain structures that are placed on, different ways of knowing, particularly, in the experimental sciences or even the social sciences. Papers follow a certain format. There's obviously more flexibility as you get into the humanities disciplines and even, within various humanities disciplines, you might find variation between one. And the other part of the discussion was in terms of, there has been even some cultural shifts moving from the passive voice to first person. And why did, what was behind some of those shifts, and, are those indications that, the ways that people have approached these things and, just this very highly structural approach, maybe there's better ways to think of it, but because these structures have been established in certain ways and they're the rules and it's how you get published, you kind of have to do that if you want to, follow the same pathway, and maybe those pathways are things we should maybe question a little bit more.
Yeah, great. So this idea of writing and publishing, that's a huge piece of higher education, academia, research of what counts as knowledge and how we share that knowledge and communicate it. I like that perspective too, of passive versus active voice, of who's doing it and why do we use, typically, in my experience as an undergraduate student, it was like, you don't use I and we in your writing. But that removes the humanity in a lot of ways from those actions in that space. Okay, so thinking about papers, writing, communication, and questioning those things. Does anybody else want to add to that or to share some other thoughts that you had from your group?
Well, right at the end of our conversation, and McCoy was talking about authenticity and the importance of that as an instructor to the students. And that engagement, then I always love when the fact that students come to you afterward and they have conversations with you because they have that level of comfort that you presented them. So I think that's valuable.
Yeah, so that relational aspect of between you and the students, and having that as a tool or as a way to create or continue knowledge, conversations, or what that might look like. Okay, thanks for sharing. A little bit more in the chat about passive voice as well. Well, thank you for sharing. Again, we'll continue having these conversations as we move into this last piece of thinking about decolonization. So kind of to give you an idea of where we're at, we started with this broad idea of equity-based policies, being more race conscious, and the way that we're taking that lens is thinking about decolonization. And decolonization, part of that is thinking about, well, let's be self-aware. Let's try to figure out ways, what are the norms within our disciplines? What are the norms within my classroom? And then the lens that we're taking from that is thinking about, okay, ways of knowing. So let's tap into thinking about ways of knowing in our discipline within the classroom. How is that impacting this colonized space, or how could I decolonize and kind of take a step back and normalize other things or normalize other ideas? And so I'm going to share my screen again to get into this last piece. So we've kind of funneling down further and further into this last section of our conversation today. Okay, and can everybody see this okay, the presentation? Okay, thank you. So we've talked about ways of knowing currently, and you've brought up some ideas of other alternative ways or multiple ways of knowing. So what other ways of knowing could you incorporate into your classroom? And I'm going to present only one idea or one way to think about it. And then you'll spend some time in your same breakout rooms to have a conversation about how that could look like for you specifically. Let's see. There we go. So remember, I mentioned these different ways of knowing text. So we've talked about publications, science communication, how those kind of drive the knowledge that's created in our field and disseminated. There are things like observational knowledge, relational knowledge. So something that was brought up earlier of how you relate to other people, whether it's students, but also thinking about how you relate to your content and to the ideas and the concepts. And then we move into this space that I haven't had a lot of experience as a STEM educator seeing of thinking about spiritual knowledge or knowledge that comes from ceremonies or from dreams or things like that, that other ways of knowing could be. So I'm going to present this idea of holographic epistemology by Dr. Meyer, who is a Hawaiian educator. And what she talks about specifically are these three different spectrums, or these three different aspects of a hologram. That's kind of where it comes from. So we have body, mind, and spirit. So in her interpretation and ways of thinking about ways of knowing is we have body, and this is something that we might be pretty familiar with. It's external, it might be seen as objective, it's physical, it's the science, it's the actual measurements that we're making. It's that body, something that you can touch, something that's remembered in bone and muscle. She also talks about mind, which is something I think we also attend to within our teaching and learning, something that's internal, that's subjective, that's looked through our lens. It's a world of thought, it's linked to phenomenons. And then this other idea of spiritual ways of knowing. So it's transpational, it's quantum, it's something that's descriptive, it's spiritual, it's ethereal, it might be mystic, it's experiential. Maybe some other ways that you could think about these three things that she talks about in this paper is body, thinking about the culture. What are the things that you can physically see? So one way to think about that in terms of your teaching and learning is if you were to walk by like for me, a chemical engineering classroom, what does it look like? What does the culture show up? What are the observable things that I see there? When you're thinking about mind, you could think about metacognition. So how are you being reflective in your learning and teaching? And then some ways that you could think about spiritual is intuition. And I know this is something that ASCE has, I think there's a group that's thinking about what intuition is. What does that mean? Where does that come from? How do you utilize it? How do you grow? How do you develop your intuition? But I did want to take a moment to tap in a little bit more into this idea of spirituality, because when I bring this up with educators, but also with my students, there seems to be this uncomfortable tension in that space. And part of it is because some people's views of spirituality align really closely to religion. And that's not always the case. You can be religious and spiritual, but you can be spiritual and not religious. And so I thought I'd help kind of break down what spirituality could look like by using this quote from, Bell Hooks is quoting the Dalai Lama in her book, Teaching Critical Thinking. And they say that spirituality, I take to be concerned with those qualities of the human spirit, such as love and compassion, patience, tolerance, forgiveness, contentment, a sense of responsibility, a sense of harmony, which bring happiness to both self and others. So why I wanted to bring up spirituality is, as I mentioned before, I think we attend to body and mind pretty frequently in the way that we think about ways of knowing. But this is another way that we can tap into how we relate to others, that process of becoming aware and whole. How do you become self-realized or self-actualize? Being conscious and mindful in what you're doing, and that collective learning piece. So maybe these different words or these different ideas present to you a different way that you could think about your classroom or the way that you teach things. And thank you for people who are leaving. I know that it's 3 o'clock. So before we move into this last piece, this last breakout room, I just want to bring it back to what we're trying to do here. Is we're reconciling the disparity in worldviews. It involves recognizing and confronting our thought worlds as possible sites of colonial complicity, and this is no easy task. So the work that we're doing, again, it's ongoing process. It's not an easy thing. It's something that continually needs work. It is an act of decolonization, which requires intentionally re-evaluating from a critical perspective what we value as sources of knowledge and truth. So you've already done some of that work today in this space, is thinking about those ways of knowing. What are some ways that we can tap into outside of what's traditionally been normalized within our STEM spaces? So the last breakout room is you're going to be put with your same groups again. So we've talked quite a bit about different decolonization. Actually, people are leaving, so maybe we can make smaller groups and that could be okay. But I want you to think about, so we've talked about decolonization, what that looks like, talked about ways of knowing for you. And now I want you to think about, for you specifically, identifying at least one way that you could integrate an element of body. So the culture, thinking about culture, mind, how you could be more metacognitive in your work, or spirit, thinking about intuition or that relational human aspect of things, into a lesson or topic that challenges your current ways of thinking and knowing. So I'm going to pause for a moment. So what questions do you have about this question that I'm asking you to engage with? I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'll put this in the chat so you can see it too. And this is a great place to just kind of sit with each other and throw ideas out there. There's no right or wrong if you're in a space of just trying to think of ideas. But we'll put you in breakout rooms again.
I started.
Oh, perfect. And we'll take about maybe 10 more minutes again. So about 3:13 to have a conversation. Thanks, Stacy. Welcome back. See a familiar face. Hi, Mark.
All right, it looks like we're all back. Let me confirm that. Nope, we're not all back in 18 seconds.
Makes sense, Robin. We'll have fun with your interview. Thanks for attending.
Okay, folks, so just like before, we love to hear from one or two groups. This is a more intimate group now. So maybe one or two people, what did you discuss in the breakout rooms about how to integrate holographic epistemology into your learning environments or work environments?
This doesn't exactly answer the question, sorry, but our group was talking about even just like taking a step back to think about how we're changing our own ways of thinking in ourselves first. Because obviously, you know, as you said, this takes time and it's a lot of work. So just not necessarily pressuring ourselves to, you know, immediately like change our students in the classroom, but also just working on ourselves.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, I'm
Christina?
curious within that too of, was there something specifically that you talked about on thinking about for yourself of things you could do? Seems like that was a similar in Robin's group.
Well, the idea came from when we were sharing our the current jobs that we had and the challenges of changing the way you've been taught to think about these things. Like I said, I've been stamped out into a particular shape by this system, and so I'm very good at reproducing that same shape.
Mhm.
So if I'm
Mhm.
going to start to mold a different shape, I was just coming to the realization, and I wrote in my notes that it takes time to do that. It takes time to decolonize that way of thinking and to think in some other way that no one has taught me before. So it kind of came from that, and we were discussing what grades meant, at least in my context, or how to grade differentially. So not so much focused on the curriculum or the material, but what the structure, I guess, meant, and then how we are and who we are within that structure, and then how to change ourselves, but slowly, because it is a heavy lift. The job is already difficult as it is and arduous, let alone in whatever political and geographical context we exist in. And on top of that, also changing the epistemology of engineering in your mind, that can be a lot. So just to extend grace, hold yourself accountable, but extend grace to yourself.
And it's that reevaluating process, like being self-aware. Yeah. And so asking those questions of why, maybe it's taking a moment to say, like, why do I grade a particular way? Or why do I have my course set up in this way? Or why do I create homework in that way? And the thing with teaching is, if we teach for a long time, we have lots of points where we can change things. But in the moment, the term, it's like, oh, I'm going to focus on one thing this term and see what happens. And then maybe the next term I can focus on something else. But yeah, that continually personal reevaluation, it's definitely a process.
Maybe one more person before we transition. Okay, if not, Christina, you can cue up the slides.
Nope. I'm going to share my screen again, so watch out for that. There we go.
You can go to the next one.
Yep.
Thank you. All right, so this is the final piece of our workshop, and it's going to be a silent group discussion of some sorts. So this is our call to action. So as a form of feedback for this experience, we'd like for you to reflect on what you're taking away from this session. So the first prompt on this Google Doc that I will drop into the chat asks you something that resonated with you today. So we talked again very broadly about what educational equity means. One way that you can implement that or take actions to change the culture of the STEM teaching and learning environment, or any teaching and learning environment that you're in, or honestly any environment that you're in, is through thinking about it through a lens of decolonization. So thinking about how or whether something in that space resonated with you. And then what action? So what's one thing that you plan to do after our discussion today? And it could be continuing to learn, right? That's the spectrum that we showed at the very beginning. There were many 5s, 6, and 7s, but there were 1s and 2s as well. And maybe something that was reintroduced or brought up in this space maybe cause you to reevaluate where you were on that spectrum. And that's okay. We've done this workshop before where folks were just like, I'm at a 3 and a 5, right? So this is fluid because we're learning and there are new terms constantly. So again, here is the link to a light feedback form, but a closing reflection for you. Hopefully you all have access to it.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see the Google Doc more fully.
I'm seeing folks in there. So again, there are 2 questions. And so I'll give you about 2 to 3 minutes to think about what you'd like to contribute, and then we have a few closing slides.
Yeah, I think we can share slides, Stacy, as well as references. We'll pass that along to, I think, Christina or Bree can share
Yeah.
that.
Yes, Christina will send a follow-up email after today's session. And she can include the resources and the presentation slides.
Right, it looks like our typing has slowed down a bit in the doc. I'll give folks one last minute to think about an action item that they'd like to add. All right, so I think Christina on our next slide has an invitation in case it seems like some of you are writing down continuing to learn, and I'm all about accountability. So Christina has an invitation for you all to continue learning with us, and I'll let her extend that to you all.
I won't share this slide just a second. But yeah, so there's a couple ways of action items of what you could do to engage more. And one of those is, if you remember at the beginning when I was talking about my educational journey, this was a space that I wanted to create for myself, and I didn't have the language or knowledge to think about decolonization and what that was. So what I did is I started a reading group called like Decolonizing STEM Reading Group. And it's been going for 2 years now. We've read the books Decolonizing Methodologies, which I shared today by Smith. We read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Kimmerer, who's a biologist, A Community as Rebellion by Lorgia Garcia Pena, and then Teaching Critical Thinking by Bell Hooks. And the reason why I started this reading group is because I thought I haven't read anything by Bell Hooks. I haven't read anything by people that I think these ideas that I want to become more familiar with. And so I wanted to do that in a space with other people who might be beginning that journey too. And so I'm off, haven't done this yet or before, and so I'm seeing how this works, but I'd also like to invite anybody in this space if you want to join that reading group. What we'll be reading for the spring term is Native Presence and Sovereignty in College, Sustaining Indigenous Weapons to Defeat Systemic Monsters. And so here, I'll share my slides again so you can see what I'm talking about. Just a second. So if you're writing something, sorry if it kicks you out of that. So that's the book that we'll be reading. I'll put in the chat a link to a registration form. I'll also include this in with the slides as well, if this is something that you're interested in. We'll begin in March, and it's pretty low key. We read a certain amount of chapters a week, and then we just come together and talk about what we learned, what we thought about it, how it relates to us and our work. As I mentioned before, this is a space for people who, oh, seems locked. You're probably right. I will unlock it in just a second. So thanks for pointing that out. So it's just a space for STEM educators or people who are just interested, who've not really wrestled with these ideas or come into contact with the ideas or language, to come together and do that. So I'll open the form in just a second. But yeah, I think, Stacy, if there's anything you wanted to add, these are the books that we've read. I'll stop sharing my screen so I can open that form for you.
Yeah, so thanks for sticking around till the end. This was awesome. I hope that we had the session objectives to close out what we were going to talk about. I can say them and drop them in the chat, but hopefully you agree with me that we've reached some understanding or some development of what these are. So our goals were, if you recall, and you can read along, begin to identify equity-focused policies and actions in your environments. Begin to identify and define the effects of colonization in your classroom or environments. Describe what knowledge is to you and your discipline, and think about ways that we can integrate body, spirit, and mind into teaching and problem solving. So that is all that we have for you all. We're happy to stick around if folks have questions, but thank you for spending your Friday afternoon with us, and we look forward to seeing you all again.